A chessboard with 64 squares. A familiar game where players calculate every move, where each piece has its own distinct role. But for those consumed by a thirst for blood, this board is more than just a battlefield of intellect. It becomes a diary of death. Who will be the chosen one? This is the most shocking case in Russia during the 2000s, when a series of bodies were discovered in Pichushkin Park, each bearing eerie signs. At first glance, these victims seemed unrelated, but the deeper investigations dug, the more the pieces began to fit together, all linked by the hand of a cold-blooded murderer. Who was he? What drove him to kill dozens of strangers? And that number, 64? Was it truly the end? Right now, let's follow every clue to uncover the hidden truth behind this chilling string of events. Pichushkin Park is known as the largest and most mystical natural sanctuary in Moscow, Western Russia. Spanning over 2,200 hectares, it is a vast expanse of dense forests, meandering streams, and winding trails that exude poetic charm. This park is not only Moscow's green lung, but also an ideal retreat for office workers, groups of young friends gathering to sing and play, or couples strolling hand in hand, serenaded by the rustling wind. Perhaps that's why, despite being officially established in 1992, Pichushkin Park remains a beloved destination for nature lovers and those yearning for peace amid the bustling cityscape. Though it holds its own poetic charm, hidden within are mysteries and crimes that once shook the world. Rewinding time to the summer of 2005, specifically on June 22, a group of young people were strolling through a dense, grassy area of the park when they stumbled upon something strange among the decaying leaves. Curious, they moved closer to inspect it, only to be left frozen in shock. Before them lay a mutilated corpse, the skull shattered, with a blood-stained bottle of vodka nearby. The police quickly arrived at the scene and identified the body as a man around 50 years old. He had no identification, no witnesses, and no obvious clues pointing to the perpetrator. After an initial assessment, authorities suspected it could be the case of robbery, murder, or a violent altercation gone too far. Wasting no time, they launched an extensive investigation, determined to uncover any leads that might point to the killer. However, after days of searching, the case seemed to reach a dead end, with no solid evidence to pursue. The police had no choice but to classify it as unsolved. But just 3 months later, as winter crept into Moscow, the Pichushkin forest once again became a graveyard, this time for two new victims. One was a 42-year-old man, the other 37. What was even more chilling was the fact that both victims had been murdered in the exact same manner as the previous one. Skulls crushed and a vodka bottle left at the scene, almost like a sinister signature. By now, investigators were deeply unsettled. They began to suspect that a serial killer might be lurking in the shadows. But with no concrete leads, the investigation once again stalled. Then months of eerie silence passed. It seems as if the nightmare had ended, until 3 more bodies surfaced between December 2005 and February 2006, bringing the death toll to 6. At this point, forensic specialists confirmed a disturbing pattern. All 6 victims had been attacked from behind, and their injuries suggested the killer had used a compact, blunt weapon, possibly a hammer or a small sledgehammer. But this murderer was as methodical as he was ruthless. He left behind no traceable evidence. The vodka bottles, potentially crucial pieces of evidence, were wiped clean of fingerprints. No clear fingerprints could be found in the dirt. And most terrifying of all, he seemed to have no discernible pattern in choosing his victims. This randomness left the police wandering in a thick fog, groping in the dark without a single solid lead. However, just as the investigation seemed to be at a standstill, officers unexpectedly spotted a suspicious-looking man loitering in the park. What caught their attention the most was the heavy hammer he clutched tightly in his hand, as if ready to strike at any moment. Suspecting he could be the killer, the police immediately detained him, hoping this would be the breakthrough they desperately needed to solve the string of gruesome murders. But during interrogation, the man vehemently insisted he was innocent. He claimed he had heard rumors about a murderer lurking in the forest, so he carried the hammer for self-defense. A reasonable explanation, perhaps. But who goes for a walk in the woods armed with a hammer like that? Finding his statement suspicious, the police searched his home, combed through potential evidence, and interrogated him for hours. Yet, they found no direct link between him and the murderers. Eventually, they had to conclude he was not their perpetrator. The following months passed in frustration, despite exhaustive efforts, scouring every inch of the Pichushkin forest, questioning every homeless person living nearby. Nothing of value turned up. That was until June 2006, when an unexpected phone call reignited their hope. On the other end of the line was a man who introduced himself as a colleague of Marina Musala, a 36-year-old single mother. He reported that she had been missing for several hours, but that wasn't all. He also revealed that Marina had mentioned meeting a man she had recently gotten to know. Feeling uneasy about the encounter, she had written down the man's phone number and the location of their meeting before leaving home, placing the note on her table. What seemed like a simple phone call turned out to be the key to the entire case. Wasting no time, the police rushed to Marina's home and found the note she had left behind. Immediately, they dialed the number on it. "Hello, are you a friend of Marina Musala?" "No, I don't know her at all," the man stammered before abruptly hanging up. Refusing to let the lead slip away, the police proceeded to investigate the location mentioned in the note. It led them to a subway station. There, they reviewed security footage and made a crucial discovery. Marina had indeed arrived, and she wasn't alone. She had been with a man. But who was this man? What happened to Marina? And was the case truly limited to just 6 victims, or were there more bodies yet to be uncovered? Stay tuned as we unravel the horrifying events. peaceful day in May 2001. In a park at the heart of Moscow, Alexander struck again. His next victim was Yevgeny Pronin, a 52-year-old man who had no idea that his trusted chess companion had secretly decided to turn their meeting into a death sentence. Yevgeny Pronin was a simple man. His days revolved around playing chess in the park with old friends, sipping free vodka, and earning the nickname Kai, a name that had become synonymous with his lifelong struggle with alcoholism. It was not a title of pride, but it was one he never denied, and that was exactly the weakness Alexander needed. The day after yet another ordinary chess match, Alexander flashed a warm smile and made a casual suggestion. "Today is the anniversary of my dog's death. Let's go to its grave and have a drink in its memory." To Yevgeny, this was an invitation he couldn't refuse. A free drink, a sentimental moment. He nodded eagerly, even laughing in excitement. The two left their chessboard behind and walked deep into the forest behind the park. No one knew what they talked about. No one would ever know what Yevgeny said in his final moments. But what was certain was this. As the last drops of vodka slid down his throat, Alexander suddenly swung the bottle and smashed it against the back of his head. Yevgeny staggered. He collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by searing pain, and before he could even understand what was happening, the darkness of the sewer swallowed his body whole, drowning in sewage, a death so cruel, so unimaginably horrific, that no one would even want to think about it. If someone were to take their own life, would they ever choose such a disgusting, painful way to die? No one would willingly end their life in filth, in darkness, and suffocating stench. And that was Alexander's brilliantly twisted idea. To create a crime so repulsive that no one would want to investigate too deeply, because this did not look like murder. After disposing of Yevgeny, Alexander simply went home. No panic, no regret. Instead, he indulged in a sick ritual, marking each victim like a trophy hunter counting his kills. At first, he used a sliding board with 15 squares, cut from newspapers and magazines, planning to stop at 15 murders. But even that wasn't enough, so he devised a new way to keep score. A chessboard, a game of strategy, control, and cold calculation. Just like his murders. That raises an unsettling question. Why the chessboard? Was it just a way to count his victims, or did it hold a deeper meaning? Perhaps to Alexander, every victim was nothing more than a chess piece in his grand game against fate. He didn't kill out of hate. He didn't kill out of anger. He killed for one simple reason, because he could, and he wanted to turn murder into a game. But every game has an end. The only question left was, when would Alexander stop? And more terrifyingly, who would be the next pawn to fall? Just 6 days after he murdered Yevgeny, Alexander struck again, his next piece on the board, Vasilevkov, a 64-year-old man whom Alexander met by chance at a subway station. Alexander struck up a conversation, easing his way into Vasilov's trust. With a warm smile and a friendly offer, he invited him for a drink. To Alexander, building rapport wasn't just part of the plan. It was a game. A hunt where the prey had no idea they were being stalked. Alexander always chose the same type of victim. Elderly men, lonely, homeless individuals, alcoholics. These were easy targets, people whom society had already forgotten. All it took was the promise of free vodka and cigarettes, and they willingly followed him into the forest. They thought they were heading into a night of laughter and drinking. In reality, they were walking to their death. Alexander repeated the same twisted script, luring them into the woods, getting them drunk, then shoving them into the sewer, leaving them to drown in filth and darkness. Everything seemed flawless until 1 month later. His next victim was Yuri, a 60-year-old man of unknown identity. This time, however, things did not go as planned. For the first time, Alexander faced resistance. When Yuri was pushed into the sewer, he desperately grabbed onto a metal bar, clinging for his life. Alexander wasn't prepared for this, but instead of panicking, he adapted. He climbed down, squeezing through the sewer opening. Then, with merciless force, he began beating Yuri's hands, smashing his fingers until his grip weakened, until he could no longer hold on, until he fell to the bottom, swallowed by the darkness. One killing is already unimaginable, but physically attacking a dying man to ensure his death, that wasn't just murder. That was something far worse. Alexander wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a predator, cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. For days later, he struck again. Like a wild beast that had tasted blood, he couldn't stop. His next victim was Nikolai Tikhov, 65 years old. 3 days after that, Nikolai Filipov, 73, left his house to buy cigarettes and never came back. Another 3 days passed, and Oleg Lyov, 49, became the next to fall. The body count kept rising. The intervals between the murderers grew shorter and shorter. Alexander was no longer carefully planning his kills. He was acting on pure, unstoppable instinct. Within just 10 months, he had murdered 10 innocent people. Terrifying. Strangely, there was no public panic, no intense police investigation. Why? Because his victims were the forgotten ones, the homeless, the drunks, the outcasts of society. No matter how brutal their deaths were, they were easily dismissed as accidents. Even when his 11th victim miraculously escaped and reported him to the police, they ignored it, believing the man was just another drunk with a foggy, unreliable memory. For the first time, Alexander was forced to stop. He lay low for 6 months, avoiding suspicion. But he didn't give up. Instead, he experimented with a new method, throwing his victims from the 16th floor of a building. Yet, even this didn't satisfy him. So he returned to his old hunting ground, Pichushkin Park, his personal playground of death. But this time, something was different. For the first time, his next target was not an old, homeless man. He set his sights on a woman, Maria Vera, a 19-year-old girl, a pregnant 19-year-old girl. But Maria wasn't like the others. She was pushed into the sewer. But she survived. After Alexander left, she crawled out, screaming for help, and was rushed to the hospital. Surely, this attempted murder would finally force the police to act. Right? Wrong. Because Maria was an undocumented immigrant, the police used that against her. They threatened her into silence. Alexander's plan wasn't just brutal, it was genius. Even when people escaped, no one believed them. Even when bodies piled up, no one connected the dots. He wasn't just lucky, he was protected by a broken system, and so he continued to kill. But now he was bored. The old methods weren't exciting anymore, so he decided to try something new. A pen gun. Yes, a real working firearm disguised as a pen. I always thought these things only existed in spy movies, or at best were useless gimmicks. But they were real and easily available. On August 24, he picked a 43-year-old man, German Shiryako. He tested the pen gun on him, and it worked perfectly. Over the next few months, Alexander killed 12 more people using this method. And just like that, his murder spree continued unchecked. For 2.5 years, he slaughtered victim after victim, while Russian police remained completely unaware. Rumors of the madman of Pichushkin Park had existed since the 1990s, but no one took them seriously. To most people, it was just an urban legend, a scary story to frighten children. There was no evidence, no proof, nothing to suggest that such a killer existed until it was too late. But everything changed in 2005. Alexander no longer wanted to hide his victims. Now he craved fame. He wanted the news to talk about him. He wanted a title, the Master of Murderers. I honestly cannot comprehend what kind of person Alexander was. I've never heard of anyone this insane. His new plan took months to prepare. Then, on September 28, 2005, he made his move. His first public victim was Yuri Kitov, a 46-year-old man. Alexander got Kitov drunk, forcing him to down an entire bottle of vodka until he passed out. Then, he poured more alcohol into his mouth, pinched his nose shut, and shook his head violently. Kitov choked to death, drowning in pure alcohol. His death was easily dismissed as alcohol poisoning, a flawless kill, so Alexander continued. The next month, he murdered Nikolai Orov, a 31-year-old homeless man. His body was found the next day, but once again, the police blamed alcohol, a deadly mistake. Because Alexander now realized the police were too careless, he became bolder. This time, he chose a more dangerous target, a former police officer he knew, Nikolai Zaharchenko. Alexander killed him with a hammer. Then, in a twisted act of mockery, he shoved the broken vodka bottle into his shattered skull, a signature a challenge, as if he was daring the entire city to catch him. From that moment, the real bloodbath began. In just the last 2 months of 2005, Alexander murdered 10 more people. The death toll had now exceeded 50 victims. The police could no longer ignore it. Finally, the authorities couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. But by then, it was too late. The name, the Madman of Pichushkin Park, was no longer just an urban legend. It was a terrifying reality. However, what caused a seasoned serial killer like Alexander, who had mastered the art of hiding, to make the fatal mistake that led to his capture? Was it his arrogance, or had his uncontrollable bloodlust made him reckless? Indeed, his final victim was Marina Musala, a new colleague of Alexander. Although she agreed to go on a trip with him, she felt uneasy. So before leaving home, she left a note for her son, a simple piece of paper, listing Alexander's name and phone number. But that wasn't all. To be even safer, she called a trusted colleague and shared her plans, just in case something happened. Tragically, Marina's suspicions were justified. She too fell victim to the bloodthirsty murderer. Like the others, her body was found in Pichushkin Park, with a cold vodka bottle jammed deep into her fractured skull. But after Marina, there were no more victims, because the police finally caught Alexander thanks to the information Marina had left behind. So after years of terror, with more than 50 victims, it all ended because of one impulsive decision. But think about it. If Alexander hadn't killed Marina, how many more could have died? Even the thought of it is chilling. What sentence could possibly match the monstrous crimes he had committed? Would justice ever be enough for his victims? Don't look away yet, because the truth is even more terrifying. As expected in 2007, Alexander was officially put on trial in Moscow. The case captivated the nation, becoming one of the most discussed topics in Russia. But as Alexander was led into court, he showed no remorse, no fear. Instead, he smirked and declared before the press, "I will return to Pichushkin Park. My hands still remember the hammer well." His arrogant words sounded like a challenge, but at the same time, they marked the end of his reign of terror. Perhaps, in that moment, his defense lawyer simply sighed in defeat, because with a client like this, no strategy could save him. In the end, Alexander was convicted of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders, a total of 52 victims, a horrifying number. But because the police could only charge him based on concrete evidence, Alexander refused to accept this modest count. Instead, he insisted that the official number be raised to exactly 61, as if boasting about his kill count. Absolutely insane. Throughout the trial, Alexander was held inside a bulletproof glass cage, a scene eerily reminiscent of the trial of Andrei Chikatilo, Russia's most serial killer before him. But make no mistake, this wasn't a mark of infamy or greatness. The cage wasn't there to honor him. It was there to protect everyone else in the courtroom from his unpredictable madness. In Russia, for monsters like Alexander, this had become standard procedure. And then, the final verdict was delivered. Alexander Pichushkin was sentenced to life in prison, with the first 15 years to be served in solitary confinement. Now, he would never return to Pichushkin Park, never hold his hammer again, never claim another innocent victim. A fitting punishment. But was it enough to ease the suffering of the families who lost their loved ones? Was it enough to erase the fear that his name still brings? Justice had been served. But this legacy of terror would haunt people forever. Their story isn't just about a serial killer. It is a mirror reflecting the hidden flaws of society, the neglect of the authorities, warnings that were ignored, the vulnerability of those lost in addiction and despair. If the police had acted sooner, if these deaths hadn't been dismissed as accidents, perhaps this tragedy wouldn't have lasted so long. Alexander didn't just kill people, he killed trust. He didn't just take lives, he destroyed people's faith and safety. A once peaceful park became a nightmare, a place where a killer roamed freely for years. Alexander wasn't just a monster, he was a consequence of neglect, a symptom of a society that sometimes turns away from what seems inconvenient. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. No one can rewrite history, but we can learn from it, so that cases like this never happen again, so that innocent lives are not forgotten, so that justice never comes too late.